I'm going to show you some basics of some more camera rigging and techniques that can help you make these complicated movements really simple. So what we have here are some basic pieces of type. So we've got 2 motion and graphics. Let's go to a 2 view here so you can kind of see what's going on. So I have my camera pointing here, and then it moves. You can see how it rotates and focuses on the graphics part. So what we're going to do, that's a relatively complicated movement, but it's actually really simple to set up. So what we're going to do is just start with a new comp, and then I'm going to start with some type. And then I'll just duplicate that. And then what we're going to do here is put both of these in 3D space. And I'm just going to move this transformation and push it back in Z space. And if you wanted to grab this, you can too. And then I'm also going to mess with the orientation just to really make it a little bit more complicated. All right, we'll just kind of leave it at that. And so I've got 2 pieces of type, and they're both in different spots. So now let's set up our camera by setting up a new camera. 15mm will work for me. And I want you to be able to see both pieces of type. That may be something that we'd worry about in another kind of composition, but for this demo I want you to be able to see it because we're going to add some depth of field effects to it. And then I'm going to add a new null object. And then what we're going to do is parent the camera to the camera null. Now we're going to set up a couple of things here. So if you look at the transform properties on the camera, so it's focused where the null is, and that position is tied to the null. So the position of the camera and the position of the null are going to be connected. What I want to do is put this focus distance, I want to position it and connect it to the position. So I'm going to option click or alt click on the focus distance to open that up as an expression and pick whip this to the position on the camera. And you'll notice that those even out, but I want that to be a negative number. So I want this to equal that. So I need to multiply. So Shift 8 will star -1. So I'm adding that to my expression. And so what that's going to do is connect the focus distance to the position. And this is what was going to make that movement really easy, because the focus on the camera is always going to stay right with that null object. So we have those 2 things connected. So now what I can do is simply, let's take the transform properties on the motion. We'll start with motion here. And if I just click on the position and then hold Command and the orientation and just Command C, copy, and then when I go to the null, I can create a position and rotation. Oops, let's make sure that's in 3D space. Position and orientation. And when I paste those, it pastes those values there. And then I go down a second or so. I can grab the position, oops, and orientation, Command C, back to the camera null, and it pastes those values there. So what's that doing really quickly then is just using those position and orientation values so that the focus is that null moves into those positions. It automatically moves the camera and the focus to those same positions because of the way we've set up the rig with those parenting options, those expressions. So this expression of the camera transform and the focus distance. So it's a relatively simple connection, but you can see real quickly how it's kind of cool and works nice. We'll add a little bit of a work area change here. So you can see how that's working. It gives it a really nice movement. So we can add a couple of other things like depth of field to this, as well as if we were to add motion blur. So I can just simply turn that motion blur on. We'll add motion blur to both of those. And you can see this is going to take a lot more rendering time, but it does give a little bit of motion blur to those, which makes it a little bit more realistic. Now realize that motion blur and depth of field will add a lot of rendering time to your project. So if you want to just turn that off, you can work and things will render a little quickly while you're working, but then when you render your final output, make sure you turn it back on. So I'm going to turn that back on, but let's talk about depth of field here real quick. So under the camera options, we have a aperture setting. And we set this up as pixels. And so the more pixels we have, the greater the aperture. And the wider the aperture in a camera, the greater the depth of field, or the more shallow the depth of field. So if I increase this aperture setting, and you can watch this area right here, as I increase or decrease that, it gets fuzzy and soft and out of focus. And so what that does is just create a really shallow depth of field. And so when we move through that, it's kind of nice too, because as you get a real extreme shallow depth of field, you can see that those letters are going to stay really soft and blurry until they come right into that final focus. And again, this is going to add a lot of render time to it. You can see that it's just kind of chugging through this simple movement, but that can give you a lot more dynamics in what you're working with. So just adding a little depth of field. And so that again is simply by increasing the aperture on your camera parameters.